Cool. So it went right to being live. All right, so we're live. So another unplanned live. I've been doing some of these unplanned lives on Saturdays because I'm not really sure when I want to do my next live. And I'm also debating if I should start taking some of these lives and take some of the topics that I discuss and break them down into shorts or segments. Shorts has been kind of my go-to lately, just for the simple fact that it seems like the shorts are not only easier to create, but they kind of just a quick rambling of thoughts can get out there, and then I can just move on with my day. When I get into these longer discussions around stuff, it then comes down to interaction for lives, or when it comes to videos, trying to find the proper videos that individuals are mostly interested in learning about. I think, and I've mentioned this before, that there is value in sharing resources and information with others, learning from each other. I think that's how, as a community, be it as it is, for folks that are spiritual and not sure where they exactly fit, coming together and sharing what inspires them and what they learn from, I think, can be beneficial and helpful. I see a lot of different new age kind of paths, and a lot of folks have been getting into this lately. It seems like, depending on the region that you're in, people have started moving away from quote-unquote mainstream religion. And I think that, to a certain degree, that's good. People are starting to question and think. But I think we lose something when we move away from organized religion, because religion is part of culture. Religion is part of society. And you can argue with it all you want, but religion teaches morality. Now, I've had discussions, and I've also seen discussions that I've listened to, where people are saying you don't need religion to have morals. That's true. But it seems that the less prevalent religion has become in modern society, the less moral modern society has also become. And that's a shame. I think we lose something as a peoples when we are acting like jackasses to each other all the time. But that got me thinking. When it comes to religion, where does it all come from? I've made the statement before, and I will make it again, that I feel like all religions are the same. They're all made up. It is humankind's interpretation of something that they do not comprehend. Looking back through, and I mean this applies to every single religion out there. This applies to the New Age construction paths, revival, reconstruction, whatever you want to call it, or just New Age spin-offs, period. But this also applies to the older religions that have been around for a while. Now, this is the interesting part about it. There are some folks that can claim ancient history to their spiritual practice, and to dismiss that ancient history as, oh, that's made up and it's just humans' interpretation, can be offensive to some religious practitioners. That's not the intent of this. I'm trying to cut through the BS and ignore feelings and look at facts. Religion and spirituality, we don't know. Everything that has been written down, who wrote it down, where did they write it down from? How do we know that the person who learned it appropriately? There's an old joke that had to do with the Bible. And there is a new monk who joined a monastery. And the entire goal of this monastery is to write copies of the Bible so that people can have them. So they write them all out by hand. And the older monk is showing around this new person, showing them where they write and where they keep their texts and where their blank paper is and all that good stuff. And as they're going through, the new monk who just started asks the elder monk a question, and says, how do you know that the text that you're writing down, that you're copying it down the right way? And they're like, oh, well, we translated a long time ago, so you just have to translate the English version, so it's just word for word. It's pretty straightforward. He's like, yeah, I get that, but the original translation, what if you got it wrong? And he's like, well, I'm sure we hadn't. So he shows him where he needs to go for the day, shows him where his room is, and where he gets to stay in the monastery. And the older monk was thinking. This was bothering him. It was really getting to him what was being said about the possibility of a mistranslation. So he decides to go down to the vaults and take a look. He disappears. People don't see him for hours. And they're asking him, like, oh, yeah, where's brother so-and-so? You know, we haven't seen him in ages. So they go to look for him. And they go down to the vault, and he's crying over this old version of an old Bible. And they're like, well, what's wrong? And he says, oh, it says celebrate. And it's a joke because it's, you know, instead of celibate, celebrate. And it's meant to be funny, but at the same time, there's something unfunny about it. As an individual who is interested in language and how language interprets and translates, and even the different ways that you can be articulate in a single language, like if you speak to someone who is learned and well-spoken, they might be more flowery with their words. They might have different type of, you know, language and words that you might not necessarily hear, but you get the idea of what they mean, or you can be more simplistic with your speech. This way of speaking is a direct translation of how you were raised and what sort of experiences you've had in life, which is typically why if you take older generations, they have some wonderful, beautiful stories, and they will have a completely different opinion when it comes to approaching a topic or circumstance because of what they lived through and what they went through. And I think we lose that. We lose sight of that when we look back at any ancient text. If you take something that had been written 2,000 years ago or 4,000 years ago, the time it was written down, the individuals who wrote that down had a very different look and view on the world than we do today right now. When it was passed down through each of the generations, are we sure it was never altered? Are we sure that the words they were using translate into the modern tongue we use today? What if we're crossing continents? You know, what if we're translating something from Japanese to English, or any language for that matter? Are we sure that, societally speaking, the words that we're using in English match the societal words that they would have used in those other countries? What I'm getting at, and the main thing that I'm trying to articulate here, is when I say all religions are made up and they're just interpretations, I mean that. Someone wrote it down the first time. You can believe what you want of where those words came from. A lot of people claim divine inspiration, that whatever deity they believe in told them to write these words down. But we already know words are imperfect. Take the word love. What does love mean? Think about all the different ways that you could apply the word love. I love pizza. I love my dog. I love my son. I love my brothers and sisters. I love my parents. I love my spouse. I love my friend. I love rainy weather. Can you really tell me that the word love means the exact same thing in all those scenarios? No. Take someone who's really young. Take someone who is an adolescent and just started dating, and they say that they love their person they're dating. Now, jump forward and have it be a spouse that you've spent 30 or 40 years with, going through hell building a life together, and they say that they love their spouse. You're still talking about a love for a significant other, but the experience of going through life could give it new meaning. What if it is a group or a family that uses foreign words? You know, what if they say something like "Jegelskithich," which means I love you in Icelandic, or if they say "Ja się kocham," which means I love you in Polish? Is that the same thing as saying I love you in English? And even if you were using that language, does it mean the same thing as someone who lives in Poland says I love you versus someone who lives like in the United States and says it in Polish? Does it have the same meaning and context? I think the way that we use and interpret words is massively influenced by our perception, perspective, and life experience. So I don't put a whole bunch of stock in text written by anyone. Let me pick up my fan. My dog decided to knock it over. There we go. So I don't put a lot of stock into religious text of any form. I don't care who wrote them. I don't care where they came from. And I'm not trying to insult them because, again, we as humans are fairly intelligent creatures. We can come up with our own mind. Philosophy and spirituality and religion is something anyone can produce if given time and contemplation. And sometimes what you say and share with others can be extremely moving, can be life-altering, can help you find your path, and can help you find the meaning in life that you've been missing. But I still think it's important to not put too much stock into what's written or passed by others. Another thing I want to say about passing on religious knowledge and wisdom, whether it be through writing or through words, is because of the human experience altering and twisting the perception on those words. How do you explain to someone, if you're a soldier and you have been through war, how do you explain to someone what that's like who's never been through war? I haven't. I have an idea of what I think it might be. I have seen movies and played video games that have had war in it that give me a visual representation of what it could be. I have no idea what it feels like to actually live through it. So when people are writing these down, the people who originally wrote these texts down, even if they were inspired by some divine source, they had something that moved them to write those words. But do you really think those words are going to paint a clear picture of what they experienced in that moment without feeling it or experiencing it itself? There's a couple sources for this. If you look to what the Druids may have done, who we call the Druids, they didn't use the word Druid for themselves. That's something we call them today. They passed all their teachings and lessons by word of mouth. You learned it directly from someone. It's not like you read it on your own. You had a discussion. You had a training. If you look at some of the Norse Scandinavian stuff, likewise, it was passed by word of mouth by skalds. Now, here's the thing. The skalds would have these ways of memorizing it, just like the Druids had ways of memorizing stuff. For example, like triads for the Druids, where the skalds would have a way of writing in a way that alluded to something else without directly saying it. And you see this in a lot of the sagas and eddas that were written down. They started writing them down long after the era when they believed in what was written in them, or may have believed in what was written in them. Now we have today people that are swearing by these paths. They're reconstructing, recreating these new paths with this new age stuff, but how do we know any of it's accurate? We don't. I think that's why you see so many people have UPG, unverified personal gnosis, the personal experience, because there's nothing to guide them. And it's almost off-putting to hear these people that read about a deity, know nothing about the deity, and instantly want to start worshiping that deity, not knowing what it is that they're worshiping. Likewise, though, I think you could say the same thing for some of these spiritualities that have texts from 5,000 years ago. Just because you wrote it down doesn't change the fact that it is a person's personal interpretation of divinity that they're trying to share with others. I don't like to pick on anyone for their spirituality. I don't like to exclude or center out particular spiritualities at all. I mean, I've got my opinions, but they're just opinions. People need to find what's right for them, or maybe they just go with the way that they were raised. But if you start looking at some of these texts, again, not trying to pick on, but if we look at some of the oldest texts in the world, right? Let me grab my picture here and see if I can shrink my face and pull it off to the side here. We'll go this way. We'll go this way. So one of the sites I was looking at earlier today, talk about the oldest religions in the world. Apparently there's this Kesh Temple hymn, and this is from circa 2600 BC. Now, I don't like to use the term BC, before Common Era. BCE is what I prefer to use. BC is before Christ. I mean, you use the terms you want to use. We know what we're talking about. But 2600 BC is pretty freaking old. And apparently this is just like a little bit of writing on the wall. So it's not enough for a full religion per se, but it's an example of an old text. So we would have to translate that from this language and then see if that really applies to the way we see and view things today. There's a pyramid text here from 2400 to 2300 roughly BCE in ancient Egypt. We got over here some coffin text from 2100 BC. We have the Epic of Gilgamesh from 2100 BCE. The Rig Veda, which has to do, I assume it's one of the Vedas for Hinduism. This was written down in 1700 BC. Book of the Dead, 1550 BCE. The instructions of Amenhotep, I can't pronounce that, 1300 BCE. The Samavedas from 1200 BCE, which there's a pretty big gap there from 1200 all the way back to 1700, about 500 years. Why weren't they written down together? People got new ideas, new interpretations, and wrote down what they wanted to. Another type of Veda, 1200, and then another Veda from 1200 as well. So at least those were written down together. So we have these old texts, and then we have stuff like the Bible, which everyone swears by. That is of a monotheistic, Christianic type of Abrahamic religious type of faith. And there are basically some claims that some of these were written around 586. Much newer. But a lot of people swear by this and swear it's the only way. This is from the history.com. Now, from what I understand, what's actually written in the Bible started out as Dead Sea Scrolls. That's what I believe that they were referred to. They were written on scrolls, and they were later put into text, and then they were translated. I've had a lot of people argue that there's only one Bible. Really. So if you go to BibleGateway.com, we just go to the English versions of Bibles. Every single one of these down here is a version of the Bible. All of this is different versions of the Bible. So maybe I'm just not educated enough to know the difference between these versions. Maybe they're very close. But then you translate them into different languages. You have them, in Spanish or Persian or Greek or Hindi. Is the translation the exact same? If you had multiple translators look at the same thing, would they use the exact same words? Do those words have enough weight and power to illustrate what is actually meant behind what they're writing about? You have the Quran. You have the Vedas, which we talked about a few of those, right? A couple of these, like the Rig Veda and this Arthur Veda, right? From 1200s and 1700s. A lot of this stuff has been written down and passed down. Then you have people who have stuff like the Havamauch, and they tried to claim, oh, this is an equivalent of a Scandinavian religious text. It's not. It's a poem. The poem is specifically written down in the Poetic Edda. You can also find it in the Codex Regius. And it's a neat poem. It's got some cool wisdom in it. Put myself on the other side of the screen now. Whoop. Jumping over the other side. So, I mean, it's got some cool text. Definitely have some neat things, but I've actually seen multiple translations of this, and I'll tell you right now that it's very confusing because of the way that they wrote back then. And this is only, we're talking about, right after the conversion of the last Scandinavian countries. Stuff was written down in Iceland. And if I remember correctly, so Snorri Snorkelson wrote a lot of this stuff down, and I think he wrote it down in what? It's like 200 years after they converted, so I think 1200, wasn't it? Might have to double check that. Now I'm starting to wonder. Sagan is 1300s. Yeah, so 1200 CE, or Common Era. Again, talking about different ways that people use words. You also have people who will say 80. 80 is actually a Christian term likewise. It's Latin. It's Anno Domini, which means year of our Lord. The Dusty Dut, hello. How long have you been live? I think I've been live for this session. I don't know. Oh, 20 minutes. There it is. Top left corner. Been live for 20 minutes. Talking about religious origins and text, and talking about the fact that humans are susceptible to flaws. I think what I'm kind of getting at is, I think it's okay and I personally find it as a personal preference to be spiritual and just live in the moment. I think we all have that voice deep down, our conscience, that knows what's right and wrong. And I think that we can listen to what's out there. What inspired these people to write all these texts? Okay, I call it divinity. I call it the divine. Many names for it. Some people call it the false. Some people call it the gods and goddesses. God, whatever they want. Yahweh. Allah. Whatever. There's multiple names that refers to the divine spark of creation. And some people think it's a singular being. Some people think it's a group of beings. But if people were inspired to write this stuff down, why can't you be inspired directly from the source itself? What makes this source so limited in its power that it only has the ability to speak with people 400 or 500 years ago, 2,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago? So it's so powerful that it's lost the ability to interact with us? And people will say, oh, well, you have to take it on faith. Well, that's what they tell you. Why? How do they know? People are willing to defend their spirituality and religion in the text of where it came from with their lives in some cases. Or take life from others because they don't believe the same thing. It's pretty messed up, in my opinion. Over a text that you were told was ancient and was told was right. I think that's the biggest problem I have with religion on a whole. Any religion, including New Age spirituality. You are told what to believe. Now, in many cases, you're told and then you go and experience it. People who believe in Christianity say they feel God's presence. Okay, cool. Great. At least you're living what you believe. But leave other people alone. Don't attack them for not believing the same thing as you. And I'm finding a trend in a lot of these spiritualities that there is a moral underlining theme to a lot of these different spiritual paths. So why can't we just go to the core and take out the extra? Where do you separate one religion from another? Are we really going to argue over words? Are they referring to the same thing or are they not? I've seen, not just mentioning all the different versions of the Bible, I've seen people in different cultures celebrate religion and holidays and talk about deities in different fashions and ways. How do we know they're all talking about the same thing? I saw a movie. It was a fictional movie. Apparently it was based on some historical events, even though it was jazzed up for TV, because, you know, you have to have a fun story. It's a 3-hour movie called Kingdom of Heaven. And I found it fascinating because Orlando Bloom's character, who was based off of a real person and then completely and utterly modified and turned upside down to be a completely fictitious character, is like religious without being religious. He's spiritual. He's spiritual instead of being religious, and he is given advice in the movie about being a good person, living a good life. But then I've seen other interpretations of people talking about religion and spirituality. It doesn't matter how good of a person you are if you don't believe. There's this conflicting views. I mean, even in Christianity, you see this huge separation between Catholics and Protestants. Catholics thinking that you need the church, and Protestants thinking it's just about the Bible, as long as you're following the Bible. One puts the organization above everything else, the other one puts the word, the book, above everyone else. And it's like, don't you believe in the same thing? Why are we getting stuck on these details? I don't know. I think, like I said, I feel like people get too absorbed as humans in a particular path. They get too absorbed in this has to be right because it's older, or more people believe it, or this is how I was raised. I think we tend to overcomplicate and overthink religion and spirituality and even spells and rituals. I was that way. Your channel has helped me out a lot to not do that. Well, thank you. I'm glad it was useful, Dusty Dead. But yeah, I think we all do. I've been there before too, and I'm still growing, I'm still learning. Every day I'm learning and growing in my spiritual path and in my life. And I try to reevaluate everything, re-question. Because if it's true, no matter how many times you question it, you're going to still come to the same conclusion. It's the unknowable, the things that we are going off of with blind faith, which I think is the core of any spiritual belief or religious belief, that we become blind sheep versus becoming empowered, enlightened individuals who are willing to look and see. I don't know. That was the biggest question that has been gnawing at me for many, many years now, is what made the original people that created these faiths and spiritual practices so special that they got this glean into this unknown mystery and no one else? And I'm sure people will be like, oh, you're trying to turn people away from blah, 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 this, that, and everything else. It's like, am I? I'm not trying to turn you away from anything. If you find fulfillment in following a religious text or a religion, go for it. I'm not telling you to stop. I'm just thinking that we should take a second look and consider, are we sure we're right? How trustworthy is the source that taught it to you or told it to you? Hey, Jay Wood. Good to see Jay Woodwolf. Good to see you, man. Last minute impromptu live. Appreciate you sharing all those links in the Discord. Actually, what I'm talking about right now, Jay, applies to some of the things we were recently discussing, because we were talking about Wicca and witchcraft. And one of the things that I bring up with a lot of people who are self-proclaimed witches, because I don't really know if I know for sure anyone who is from a family of witches. I've met individuals who make claims that their parents and grandparents were witches. I've met one who claims she's a third-generation witch. I've met another individual whose mother was some form of pagan. I don't know if she called herself a witch specifically, and he was raised in it, so that was at least 2 generations. But for the most part, I don't know a lot of people who have had stuff really passed down. Most people tend to be book taught or taught from the internet. They learn something and say, this is my new path for spirituality. And me and Jay were talking about the fact that, how do we know the source and origin on this stuff? There are claims with Gerald Gardner when he created Wicca, or at least made it popular in the mainstream, depending on who you speak to. And there's no hard evidence of who he learned from. How do we know he didn't just make it all up in his backyard, write it all down, and then share it? Now everyone's practicing this stuff. And then it brings up the same point that I was bringing up earlier with the interpretation of things. So you have a basic concept and idea if you take modern New Age path that we refer to as witchcraft or Wicca, because they are separate paths, even though Wicca is basically a type of witchcraft. Not all witchcraft is Wicca. I've said this before, you know, they're pretty much basically every Wiccan out there is a witch, but not every witch is a Wiccan. I've used that turn of phrase before because I think it makes sense and it's pretty straightforward. But if you look at these founders, and what I mean by founders, I mean people that are big names in the 1940s, early 1900s, right? 1940s, 1950s. You know, you see a lot of them, and they did some practices that modern witches like, oh, we don't do that. Why not? These people who wrote down the original sources, if you talk about Raymond Buckland, if you talk about Doreen Valentine, if you talk about Alex Sanders, if you talk about Gerald Gardner, we know they practiced skyclad and nude. We know this was a practice. We've seen video evidence of this. So you're not doing skyclad and nude, and you weren't initiated by a witch, and according to some of them, you have to be initiated by a witch to become a witch. So are you really practicing the same thing as them? So how did we get to where we are today with this spinoff? We're taking their word for it. And the same thing applies to these ancient texts, you know? You can go all the way back, like Hindu texts. Like Hinduism has been around for thousands of years. We have these texts that are like 1700 BCE. Like we have old ancient text. How do we know any of it's true? Just because it was written down doesn't make it true. We're also talking about people from the past, and a lot of people today are arrogant enough to believe that our perspective of the world and our worldview as a society is more accurate, closer to reality. We're more educated. We don't buy into senseless superstitions like we used to, which is why I think religion's falling off for a lot of people. I really feel like science and technology is taking over for religion and spirituality for many people, which is why I think a lot of us crave some form of spirituality. But if that's the case, then how do these ancient ways of thinking and feeling and viewing the world stand up to today's standards? Why wouldn't they grow and change with the times? A lot of these different paths seem to have, like I said, these core principles, which is about being a good person and treating others respectfully. I mean, there's moral obligation in there, but being thankful for the life we have. And there's different ways of doing it. If you look at any of those religious texts that I mentioned, or any religious text period, there's usually some form of lesson, devotion, self-discipline, enlightenment. It's all about knowledge and wisdom. It's about that personal experience, right? That's what it's all about, in my opinion. And if you want to disagree, that's fine. You can disagree. Like I said, I'm just sharing my viewpoint on this. But I think because we're in the information age, it makes sense to me to kind of browse around, read from a few different sources, and see what fits, what feels right. You might reevaluate yourself and change your mind. I know I've changed my mind spiritually many times throughout my life. Many, many times. I don't think any one of us has all the answers. And I think what appeals to me more is the philosophy, the spiritual side of learning to think for yourself and to really rationalize and, I don't know, go through it. And people make these arguments. They're like, oh, well, you know, there's this evil being and it's going to lead you astray and you need to find the courage and dedication to follow the way of the truth and light. And it's like, if you believe that, fine, but it's like, it doesn't add up. If you're talking about a being who's so powerful that it created everything and it's omniscient and all-knowing and all-powerful, how does it not know what you need to find your way? Oh, well, there's free will. Okay, well, it doesn't matter. If it created everything, it also created evil. So it made all of this. It was in its intent. And if it's all-knowing and all-seeing and all-wise, then it knew that it would tempt you and you would go and make that choice. It knows what your choice is before you make it, right? If it's all-powerful. And who are you to say how it can appear before you? Like, people argue over it. Okay, if this thing is all-powerful and you connect with this divinity and this being and it appears in a certain way, then how is it for you to tell them they're doing it wrong? How are you more knowledgeable than they are? Did it appear to you and tell you what to do? And that's the thing. If someone says, oh, I had some sort of spiritual being, some sort of deity appear to me, it sounds crazy, doesn't it? How do they know it really is the actual being that appeared to them? I've seen people arguing, some like new Scandinavian folks that are calling themselves Norse pagan, and they're like, oh yeah, Freya appeared to me and led me to the path. Excuse me, you saw a woman appear in front of you that wasn't there and then was there and tell you that it was Freya and tell you how to leave this path and then disappeared. And that's normal. Okay, well, if that being is so powerful, why isn't it appearing to everyone else and only appeared to you? Even other people who follow that similar type of a path, they're not having those same experiences. So it brings a lot of things into question. A lot. It's like, if it doesn't add up with logic, I don't know. That, again, going back to that movie I was talking about earlier, even though it's fictional, there is a scene where they are burning the dead, which is a no-no, apparently. Supposedly, in Christianity, it's a no-no to burn the dead. I don't know. That's the way they were implying in the movie. Because they will not have actual proper rest if you do not bury their remains in the ground. And as they're burning the bodies, that main character, Balin or Balor or whatever, I can't remember his name, he makes a comment saying that God will understand and God will forgive, and if not, then he's not really God, or something along those lines. And I don't remember the exact wording or turn of phrase, but the scene stood out to me because he's making the point of, again, at the end of the day, if a being is all-powerful, they would understand and know, and they wouldn't hold that against you, because if those bodies stayed, the whole city would get sick from these decaying remains. So it makes sense from a survival standpoint to do that, but from a religious standpoint, it doesn't. So there has to be a give and take. There has to be some logic involved in there, I think. I don't know. That's just my interpretation. I know some people, like I said, they're willing to die on their religious path and spirituality, and more power to you. If you know it's right, then what do you care what other people are doing? I guess what it comes down to. I'm not you. I'm not going through your experiences. I don't know how you were so sure that your path is the right path and that it's the only path. So you have something that's convinced you. Great. Well, if other people haven't experienced that, leave them alone. Same thing applies. If you don't think it's the right path and someone else is doing it, leave them alone. We don't need to go after people and try to get them to think the way we do. My point of my videos and my channel is to share the idea and to put out the conversation. It's to inspire thinking, critical thinking, and to really analyze when you're making your choices. There's so many different channels out here on YouTube or other video platforms that are all focused on telling you this is the only way to do it, and they act like they know. I'm not giving you that. I'm telling you, I don't know. I don't. And neither do you. I hate to tell you, but none of us have the answers. But if we contemplate together and share some ideas and sources, maybe we can try to figure it out as a society. I don't know. Anyway, that's my rambling for the day, my 35-minute ramble on spiritual origin and text. So, questions, thoughts, feedback, concerns, feel free to pop that in the chat. I'll hang around for a few more minutes, but I might end the live early. This will be the first live that didn't last 2 hours. All right. Well, on that note, those of you who stuck around for the live and hung out, and specifically those that said hi in the chat, the Dusty Dud and Jay Woodwolf, appreciate both of you. And everyone that's just watching and chilling out and hanging out, appreciate you as well. So hopefully others will see this in my playlist from previous lives, and we'll go from there. Talk to you later on Discord. Absolutely, yeah. Look forward to some more good conversations. So it's time to wrap this one up, and maybe we'll try to plan the next one instead of making an unplanned live and go from there. Bye for now.